It's Thursday, February 18th, 2016. We are 29 weeks shy of the 2016 NFL season. You're listening to Reel in the Field Goals, the weekly Seahawks podcast where myself, Kenneth Arthur, and co-host Danny Kelly get into the Seahawks, sometimes a little bit of Reel in the Film Goals, and whatever else happens during the show. And that's it. We can just jump right into it this week. Our guest is going to be Rob Staton of SeahawksDraftBlog.com, as well as our sister show, 3000 NFL Mock Draft with myself and Rob, where we talk about the draft. And coming up in the next couple of weeks, we got scouting combine stuff to talk about on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Danny is going to be there. Danny, you went last year. What did you learn from last year that you're going to take with you this year?
For the combine, it's like kind of chaotic. They kind of parade people in all the way through every single day. So you have to have a good plan of who you want to talk to and what you want to talk about, or otherwise it's just kind of chaos. So just learning how that works was a good lesson, and I'm hopefully going to be a little more organized this year in terms of like how it all goes down. But I mean, I think a lot of people feel or think that I can like go down on the field or whatever. The media is mostly, other than a few TV people, are put into this big conference area, and they bring the players out, and you can like sit down and talk to them with it's like round table stuff. It's not like you get a lot of one-on-one time with anybody because these guys are, just busy the whole week, barely get any sleep. They're just ushered from one place to the next, team meetings, workouts, things like that. So it's a lot of fun though.
Yeah, and as far as the combine goes, it's one of the most important days, weekends of the year in the NFL, but especially, perhaps the single most important thing about the draft, other than the draft itself. And, we said today our guest is Rob Staton. He's here with us now. Rob, you haven't had an opportunity, you live across the pond, as they say, so you haven't had as many opportunities to go to NFL events. And the combine, it would seem, would be, your top priority every year. You're so, in love with the draft that you'd love to see these guys in person. If you were in Danny's shoes, what would you be most looking forward to this next weekend at the combine in Indianapolis?
Well, the big thing, kind of an underrated thing when you follow the draft, is the players' personality and character plays a big thing in this. So even though you can't see how they're going to interview with the teams, you can get a feeling for whether or not they're going to impress the Seahawks. Because there's a general trend of it's not quite Tim Ruskell, but they do seem to go for guys who speak well, who are high character. I know that the Frank Clark pick caused a lot of controversy a year ago, but aside from that, a lot of the guys they've taken have been, high character players who've produced a lot in college and a big time athlete. So actually going to go and see these guys in person. I'd probably pick about 5 of my favorite draft prospects and just go and see them and see if kind of the expectation, it lives up to expectation, just to speak to them and sort of get to know them a little bit more. I'd have to ask them a question about the Seahawks. If they're a defensive guy, how much would you like to play in the defense? Who are the players on the Seahawks that you look up to? Stuff like that as well. I'd love to get to the combine one day. It's a little bit tricky, and I could get accreditation because I work for the BBC. I could probably get in there, but whether or not going over just a couple of days would be worth it. I am determined to go to the Senior Bowl next year because you can actually see the workouts and the practices as well as just sort of getting to speak to people. So I think it's something that I'm going to plan to do next year with my son being a little bit older these days, so I can probably escape from the house for a week. But that is something that I really want to do next year.
Well, that'd be exciting, especially for 3000 NFL Mock Draft. I certainly expect and hope that we're still doing that show a year from now.
We could do it from Alabama, Kenny. We could have
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that would be great. And 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Is it the best football podcast around? Yeah. Is it the best draft podcast around? Yes. Is it the best podcast around? Everybody's agreeing that yes, it is.
It's certainly the longest one, isn't it?
It's one of the longest. We clocked in 2:12 yesterday, and shockingly enough, people say, "Thank God this one is not some short 1.5 hour version." People actually seem to, for some reason, like them a little bit longer. That's what she said. But it's We're having a good time doing 3,000 NFL mock draft. We've been going every week since the week before the college football season this past season, and we've been going steady, just like in Real in the Field Goals. You know, we haven't missed a week here in the last 54 weeks or so. Whenever we started, so keep attention to those, and we're just going to get into some of the Seahawks news and some of Rob's opinions on the Seahawks upcoming draft and the players available in that draft. The top story today perhaps might be Michael Bennett changing, agencies. So he's going to, fire his agent, or he has fired his agent, meaning that he's up for grabs with a new agency. And you'd think that his top priority in looking for a new agent is, are you going to be the guy that helps me get a new deal with the team that told Cam Chancellor to stay home if he wanted a new deal? That Michael Bennett is one of the most underpaid players in the NFL. Rob, how do you see this? Do you see this as a problem? Do you see that his changing of agencies is a signal that there is something about to happen?
Throughout this whole thing, Michael Bennett has kind of given off the impression that he's very unhappy, and rightly so, because he's incredibly underpaid. I mean, it's ridiculous that someone like Derek Wolfe is going to get $9.5 million a year, and that Michael Bennett is not getting in that range. So he's got a legitimate gripe. That said, he seems to sort of make his complaints at the right time, so it wouldn't be a surprise within the next sort of 2 or 3 weeks when the combine's going on if he expresses again his dissatisfaction at his contract whenever the new agent is appointed. It wouldn't be a surprise if he missed voluntary workouts with the team. And then when it gets to training camp, he's probably going to be there, whatever happens. I'd like to think that the Seahawks could do something just to smooth this over, but at the same time, they have no reason to do it. Michael Bennett signed a new contract just 2 years ago, and with them being pretty tight against the cap, and with several key free agents that they need to sign first and foremost. Is the money going to be there to extend Michael Bennett now, or to give him a raise? And is the money going to be there to extend Doug Baldwin, which I'm sure they'd also like to do? So I'm not overly concerned. I'd be a bit more concerned with some of the other individuals on this team, but I think that Michael Bennett is a team player. I think he's taken on a real leadership role, and I don't think it's his intention to go down the road that Cam Chancellor did. I mean, whoever watched the Cam Chancellor saga last year is not going to think about going down that road, because it was a mess. Chancellor did not get what he wanted. It was bad for the team. It was bad for Chancellor, and I can't imagine anybody risking that again. The Seahawks played a blinder, holding the position like they did with Chancellor, and it's going to put a lot of players off going down that road.
Yeah, plus Bennett even said all the things that you'd expect in terms of, like, he's not really prepared to lose all that money, because it's after tax too that you have to pay the Seahawks and those fines. And so, yeah, I don't see him holding out. I think, how many people have held out in the new CBA? Like 2 or 3?
These damn mute buttons, man. They're not as sensitive as you'd like. Yeah, it's pretty hard to. It's less common these days, and every single one that does go down, it usually does not go in the favor of the player. So the more and more that go against the player, the fewer that there will be. By the Seahawks, allowing Cam Chancellor to stay home for 2 games and giving in and coming back, by allowing that to happen, now they've set a precedent for Michael Bennett and for anybody else that's thinking about doing it, because if they did give in to that one player, it's going to be tough, and they've got too many talented players and not enough money to go around for all of them to allow one player to change that policy. And Cam Chancellor, they called. I wouldn't even say they called his bluff. He may have had all the intentions in the world, but Cam Chancellor found out that there was nothing he could do to get a new contract, and if he had known that ahead of time, he obviously would not have held out, because it didn't do anything for him, and he didn't have a good season. He didn't have the Cam Chancellor type seasons we're used to. Rob, as far as Michael Bennett goes, let's say there was a world without Michael Bennett on the Seahawks next year. There's no way you could replace him. He's valuable for a reason. And we talked about comps in the draft to Michael Bennett on the podcast this week. If people want to check that out, we had an episode where we looked at every player on the Seahawks, the starters mostly, and said, is there a player in the 2016 draft like this guy? So you can sort of comp those players. Rob, what about free agency or trade targets or just on other teams? Do you see anybody else that plays quite like Bennett?
No, there's absolutely nobody. I mean, you could maybe look at someone like Malik Jackson and hope that he could do a similar job, but he's going to cost way too much money. The great thing about Michael Bennett is that he's so thoroughly unique, and that is something that the Seahawks, they obviously look for, whether they're drafting players or bringing them in free agency. There isn't any player quite like him. There's no real reason why he's as good as he is. I mean, this is a guy that was undrafted, had very little interest. The Seahawks cut him when Tim Ruskell was the GM, and he went to Tampa Bay and just looked really good. I mean, he's just a really good football player, and there's nothing really it's hard to find guys like this, because what do you look for? I mean, you could look for all the measurements that Michael Bennett has, all of his speed, and his testing that maybe he did pre-draft, and then compare it with another guy, and that other guy will be a guy who gets cut in camp and never makes it. I mean, there's just something thoroughly unique about Michael Bennett. I just hope that can you remember Antonio Brown a year ago, sort of semi-threatened to hold out? He'd obviously performed way above expectations when he signed his contract in 2012. And in the end, the Steelers said, look, you came into camp, you did everything the right way, you continued to perform on the field, we're going to give you a pay rise. I just wonder if the Seahawks can use that as a precedent to maybe sort something out with Michael Bennett and maybe make an example of Cam Chancellor and say, look, come and play for the team. If you outperform your deal, we will look after you. And I think that the team would respect that. I don't think that Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas are going to come forward and say, what about us in a year or two? Because ultimately they got paid at the highest level of their position. Michael Bennett is even in the top 25 of defensive ends right now. Possibly not. So he's clearly underpaid. He's a fantastic presence for the Seahawks. So I hope that there's some sort of common ground they can come to here, which means they can satisfy Bennett and they can move forward, because he's so important to the Seahawks. There just isn't another guy out there who can replace him.
I think, moving down the line, you talk about what the Seahawks are doing on their defensive line. Bruce Irvin is hitting free agency. It's still pretty unclear what kind of interest he'll garner on the open market, whether people see him as a pure pass rusher or as just a Sam linebacker or what. I think John Clayton brought it up. It's something that's been talked about recently, and the idea of Cam Wake hitting free agency. He's due $9.8 million next year for the Dolphins. He's coming off of a torn Achilles. There's talk of trying to sign him to extension, but if he doesn't want to stay in Miami, or if he thinks he's worth more than what Miami's trying to offer him in terms of his extension, there's a chance they could release him if he hits the open market. Compare and contrast like the idea of keeping Bruce Irvin for whatever he's going to be making, or maybe potentially looking for a veteran option like Cameron Wake, who might be he could be got at a lower rate than that. What would you think of those two players in particular?
I just think it's going to be. I think that there's more than just a performance about Michael Bennett. I think that he has become. If you were going to name, let me ask you two guys. If you were going to name the 4 best Seahawks on the roster a year ago, you probably say, Russell Wilson, Richard Sherman. I think that you'd probably put Cam Chancellor on there and Marshawn Lynch. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, there's a couple of free spots there, because I don't think you put Cam Chancellor on that list, and Marshawn Lynch is retired. So,
you didn't say Earl Thomas, did you?
Well, I was going to say you probably bump Earl Thomas, in there now, and there's another space which is Bennett for me. So, and it's the leadership. I mean, who was the guy after the Minnesota game who was in that locker room, stirring things up and leading things? Who was the guy who everybody was huddled around before every game towards the end of the year, sort of taking their inspiration from him? If you remove him from the locker room, there isn't a guy out there that you can bring in, and they've had an issue with bringing, outside free agents. It just hasn't really worked for them. I mean, who is the last? Michael Bennett's probably the last outside free agent who's come in and established a leadership role. So, Cameron Wake, it looks as if he's going to sign a new contract in Miami and stay there. You could pick out anybody, really. I think he's invaluable to the Seahawks. I cannot imagine a Seahawks team without him.
Rob, I think that there may have been a miscommunication, because we're talking about Bruce Irvin.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there was. I didn't catch it. Bruce Irvin, well...
Bruce Irvin versus Cameron Wake. One is younger, albeit old for a first-time free agent, and the other is older but a better player.
How old is Irvin? Irvin is 27 or 28?
Irvin is going to be 29.
29.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so Bruce...
Cameron Wake is 34 or 35. 34, I believe.
Well, we discussed this a little bit last night, Kenny, and the thing about Bruce is that you could probably sort of front load a contract for him and get him sort of a 2 or 3 year deal where he gets a lot of money over the next couple of years. So I think if you were trying to replace him in Seattle, if that's sort of what we're talking about here, I think it's going to be very hard to do. They need to find another edge rusher somewhere, just sort of add to the rotation, because they're going to lose Bruce's production when he sort of puts his hand in the ground and does that. But I think they're probably going to have to draft a very different type of linebacker. Probably just get an athlete in the draft who can fill that role. It's going to be very difficult. I wouldn't really be interested in signing, the big name free agent to sort of replace Bruce. I just think it has to be. I would look for value. So like someone like Jabal Sheard, who went to New England last year. Salary in 2015 was $4.5 million or something like that. If they can find somebody who can do that type of a role for $4 million, especially if they're going to lose people like Okung and Sweezy, they're maybe going to have a bit of free cash there. That is the type of move I would try and do. I haven't identified anybody. I mean, we were hoping that someone like there's one or two, maybe the other guy in Miami might actually do that, Vernon Olivier, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to find it very difficult to replace Bruce with somebody who could do that. They're probably going to have to find some option in the draft. But there is one or two options there.
I mean, what about Mel Kiper in his mock draft today? He talked about Robert Nkemdiche going to the Seahawks. That was who he mocked. Nkemdiche, at one point talked about, I think, as like a top 5. Had some off-field issues. What do you see as Robert Nkemdiche as a defensive end? If he actually did go to the Seahawks, how big of a player and how big of an impact could he be in year 1 and beyond?
He's a really interesting case because from a character point of view, that is going to be the big concern. There was a report from Bob McGinn, who works for the Journal Sentinel in Wisconsin, and he has sort of like some anonymous sources that he speaks to who work in scouting departments in the league. And one of the sources said that he's not just strange, he's strange, if you get what that means. That to me
fits in just quite nicely.
He seems like a real oddball and someone who is a little bit erratic and difficult to control. Now, I don't want to compare him obviously to Greg Hardy, because Greg Hardy's issues are a lot more serious than anything that Robert Nkemdiche has been accused of in college. It's not that, but their personalities maybe, or that sort of like that you never know what they're going to do next in terms of being interviewed or whatever. Or
maybe like a Charles Haley type, the 49ers guy.
I just see him potentially being a headache. Now, the other issue with him is that when you actually watch his tape in college, he underwhelmed. I mean, he was going to be, when Jadeveon Clowney came through and everybody was like, "Yo, God, this guy's going to be the number 1 overall pick one day," and he was. Everybody thought that Robert Nkemdiche was going to be exactly the same. He was the next big thing as well. And he's not lived up to that. His production was poor. He played in flashes but wasn't as good as he could have been. So you're banking on upside and character working out for this guy. So he could easily go in the top 15 and nobody will bat an eyelid because he's got the potential to be fantastic. But if he went in round 2 and dropped all the way out of the first round like Randy Gregory, it wouldn't be a surprise either.
What about Noah Spence? Is there a chance he falls to 26?
Well, Noah Spence is pretty one-dimensional. I mean, he is a speed rusher. That is it. When you sort of watch him play for Ohio State when he was there, and when you watch him for Eastern Kentucky, you just see the same thing over and over again, which is him trying to beat the edge with speed. Now, he's very, very fast, and we saw with Bruce Irvin, that's kind of all Bruce Irvin. Bruce Irvin's handwork was better than Noah Spence's, but he was predominantly a speed rusher. Those kind of guys go early, and in a draft where there aren't many speed rushers, I could see him going very quickly because there's no real alternative beyond the first round. Noah Spence is your guy, and that's it. I mean, not even Joey Bosa is a pure speed rusher, so I think he could go in the top 10 just because of his sort of natural ability to bend the edge and get there and get to the quarterback. But I think the lowest point it could go is probably somewhere in the teens. I think that New Orleans is a pretty good spot for him. New York Giants might be an option for him at number 10. He's not going. I really cannot see him lasting until the 26th pick, unless the character issues were just too strong. And if he falls to 26 because of character issues, then there's every chance the Seahawks will make sure that he moves on to number 27 as well.
Rod, does it ever get frustrating, especially over the last few years, to spend time mocking someone to the Seahawks at their first-round pick slot, only to eventually have to throw it all away because they don't have a first-round pick anymore? I mean, we're going to talk about who they could take at 26, and we'll do that today as well. But are you expecting them to actually pick 26?
I don't think they'll trade for a veteran this year like we saw with Arvin and Graham. I mean, my reaction for both of those trades it was a little bit mixed. So the first thing you think is, wow, Jimmy Graham's going to be a Seahawk next year, and you imagine it. And like one of the first things I was thinking was, I hope he doesn't get injured like Percy Harvin, so we have to wait so many weeks to see him actually play for the Seahawks. But the other side of it is, yeah, great. What am I going to talk about for the next 2 months, because the Seahawks don't have a first-round pick and we've got a blog to write. So it is a little bit frustrating sometimes, but I guess sort of the excitement of the players, the two players that were involved, made it worth it. I do think they're going to pick. They're going to use that 26 pick. It's just whether or not they use it after they've traded down. Because for me, there's, again, like most years, there's probably about 13 or 15 legitimate first-rounders in this class. They're going to go well before the number 26 pick. And then the Seahawks will be left with a situation whereby, is the 2 or 3 guys that they like, and those players going to be there if they move down 5 spots or 10 spots? And if they are, can they find a deal which is suitable for them to move down? And if not, they'll probably just take the best player available at a need position. They seemed to do that in 2011 when they took James Carpenter. I think it'll be a little bit harder this year to trade down, because the top 3 quarterbacks are going to go in the top sort of 10 picks, I would suggest. And then that's not going to be that sort of fever to move back into the top of round 1. So it might be a little bit harder this year. They might not get the value they're looking for, and they'll ultimately just take someone at 26, I think.
Do you not see Hackenberg or Connor Cook doing enough to get themselves perhaps that late first, early second buzz?
Connor Cook, no, just because I don't think teams are going to like his personality. I think they're going to be turned off by that. He wasn't a team captain at Michigan State. He's got a really odd personality. I mentioned this on our podcast, Kenny, when when Michigan State beat Ohio State, and he didn't even play in the game because he was injured, Connor Cook, and he was the first one running over to the Ohio State fans after the game to gesture with them and sort of get mixed up with them. So that's not the kind of thing you want your future franchise quarterback doing when he hasn't even played a down in the game. I think that that is going to be a bit of an issue for him. I personally think he's going to last deep into round 2. As for Hackenberg, he's just too much of a gamble, because his college tape is really bad. He's not an accurate passer. He's got all the physical tools that you would look for, but I'd be very wary of drafting him in the first round. And anybody who was sort of scared of him coming off the board in the back end of round 1 is going to have to jump ahead of Houston, because I think people will think Bill O'Brien, Christian Hackenberg, that's a natural fit. So if people were sort of trying to jump back into the first round to get Hackenberg, they may try and jump ahead of Houston at 22.
Rob, you talked about the Noah Spence explosiveness off the edge. We've talked, in depth, all 3 of us, about, explosive athletes and kind of how the Seahawks use that in their evaluation. Who are some of the top, spark athletes this year to watch at the Combine?
Well, I think the first one we have to mention is there was this report, but it wasn't so much a report, it was Bucky Brooks suggesting that Derrick Henry's going to run a 4.4 40 and jump 42 inches in the vertical at 42 pounds, which is, if he does that, and we were talking about this last night, that running back is not Seattle's biggest need, but let's just imagine a scenario where maybe they bring in a couple of veteran offensive linemen in free agency and solve it that way. I mean, in 2013, their big need was pass rush. They didn't use the draft to get it. They brought in Bennett and Averill. Maybe they will do something similar this year with a couple of offensive linemen. Let's say that they do that. Let's say that they're pretty comfortable with the depth on the defensive line, which is going to stretch deep into round 3 and 4. And then that would give them the opportunity to draft a really good athlete at another position of need in the first round. So that could be running back, that could be linebacker, that could be cornerback. If they get into a situation like that, and if Derrick Henry runs a 4.4 at 242 pounds and jumps 42 inches, he is exactly the type of player that the Seahawks have looked at in the past. And, they have valued the running back position an awful lot, a lot higher than other teams. So he is one to keep an eye on. Corey Coleman at Baylor is a receiver who I think is going to have a terrific combine. I would expect him and Will Fuller to run really well. There was some mention today, I think somebody retweeted a tweet from the Indiana head coach, which just reminded everybody that a year ago, Jason Spriggs supposedly jumped to 37-inch vertical. That would be 4 inches higher than any offensive lineman at the combine last year. That he ran in the 4.8s. That he can bench 30-odd reps at, with decent arm length. So he could be the star in terms of the offensive lineman. Jason Spriggs could be the guy that really boosts his stock, gets well into the top 20 because of a really good combine. I think that Sheldon Rankins is going to have a good one. For a defensive lineman, seems to be really, really quick. Could see him running a 1.5, 10-yard split, which would be an elite time for him. I think that the quarterbacks are going to do pretty well. I would expect Vernon Hargreaves, as much as I don't like him, to run really fast and do well. Leonard Floyd should have a good combine. Mm-hmm. Andrew Billings could have a good combine as well. And then sort of some of the players that I expect the Seahawks to show a little bit of interest in. Deion Jones, who's at LSU, is a really, really fast linebacker, really rangy. I think that he's going to have a great combine. And Ashawn Robinson should have a really good combine based on his physicality and his skill set. And he looks like a fantastic athlete at 312 pounds. So I'd expect him to do really well as well.
Happened again. And I'm getting okay. So, what about like where we are going to target it for the Seahawks? Are you leaning towards offensive line and just waiting every week and sort of seeing which offensive lineman is worth looking at today? I mean, it seems like at this point now there's always new names as well that show up in the first round. I mean, today when Kuiper's mock draft came out, he had Ryan Kelly, the center at Alabama, going 18th overall. We've never talked about him. If we've talked about any center, because it's difficult to go in the first round of the center, if we've talked about any center, it's Nick Martin of Notre Dame, who I still say is going to be your final pick for the Seahawks because he could potentially play center or guard, and he's going to be a solid player no matter what. But as far as offensive line, number one, why do you think that Kuiper has Ryan Kelly going 18th overall? And number two, is offensive line going to be your main focus for the Seahawks, or how would you order the position groups as far as where you think they'll lean right there in the first round?
Well, look, on Ryan Kelly to start with, I think that's a really left field pick, to have Ryan Kelly going that early. Now, I've spent a lot of time on Kelly because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, missing anything with him while I was watching Nick Martin, and I think that they're fairly similar. I would say that Kelly's perhaps a little bit more aggressive, and he does he creates running lanes. He does everything pretty well at the line of scrimmage. He's not a great second level guy. I don't think he's a fantastic athlete. I think if any center is going to go in the top 20, they better be athletic. And I would put Ryan Kelly probably in the top sort of 50 or 60 picks, and I would put Nick Martin firmly in the top 50. Now, both of those guys could find their way into the back end of the first round, but I don't think they're going to go as early as the top 20. What I would say is that a few years ago, Rodney Hudson went in the second round to Kansas City. He's now, I think, the best paid center in the league. And he just looked terrific. And everything that you watched him do was just exceptional. Technically brilliant, very physical, very aggressive. Loved to get to the second level. He just looked like an absolute home run pick, and he went in the second round. So if that kind of a center goes in the second round, there's every chance that Nick Martin and Ryan Kelly are going to go in the second round as well, alongside Cody Whitehair, who's also probably going to move inside to center. As for what I think the Seahawks are going to do, this is how I look at it. First of all, they've pretty much admitted with Pete Carroll suggesting that offensive line is going to be their number one priority. So until they do something about that in free agency, then that is the direction I think they're going to go. If they sign veteran offensive linemen, maybe they'll be able to look somewhere else. But they've said that's their priority. The Seahawks have consistently attacked their priorities, whether it's in free agency or the draft. So I would look for that. It is a pretty good first round for offensive tackles. Then there's a huge drop-off. So when the first 6 or 7 guys have gone, good luck finding a starting tackle if that is what your priority is. And there are some decent interior guys, but they're going to be around in rounds 2, 3, and 4. That is the first need. The second need, I would say, is you're looking at the defensive line and adding to the pass rush. Now, there's probably about 10 or 15, defensive linemen that could easily go in the first 2 rounds here. And everybody wants to talk about the defensive linemen and say what a great class it is. That said, it is not a great class for interior pass rushers, which is what the Seahawks need. So to sort of go through this very quickly, if you notice the Seahawks in base, they play a lot of size. So in 2013, it was Red Bryant, Tony McDaniel, Brandon Mebane starting in base. They take away the running game of an opponent, force them to pass it, make them one-dimensional, and then they throw in Cliff Averill, Michael Bennett, Clinton McDonald, Bruce Irvin, Chris Clemens at you. That is what the Seahawks do. They want to create chances for their secondary, and to do that, they have to take away the run. That's why they play a 330-pound three technique in 2015 in Ataba Rubin, and why Pete Carroll says he's the best three technique he's ever had. So what the Seahawks need is not a pass rusher to replace Mebane and Rubin. They want to keep that to the base stoutness against the run, which they were so good at last year. They just need to replace the lost production from Jordan Hill in 2014, and Clinton McDonald in 2013. So here's the stats. The Seahawks actually had 46 sacks in 2015, which was more than 2013 and more than 2014. So they increased their sack numbers last year. But here's the difference. 5.5 sacks Clinton McDonald 2013, 5.5 sacks for Jordan Hill in 2014, 0 sacks for Jordan Hill in 2015. There's your missing link. It's the 5.5 sacks that they had the previous 2 years that they didn't have in 2015. They need to replace that. So they need to find an interior pass rusher. Sheldon Rankins can do that job. Adolphus Washington can do that job. Then you're looking in sort of rounds 3 and 4. The rest of them are either one techniques, nose tackles, or run stuffers. And I can't imagine the Seahawks going down there. And then there's some sort of like other needs, linebacker, running back. They may add a receiver at one point. And then they'll add a cornerback probably in the 5th round like they always do. So they're the kind of needs that I'm looking at.
Rob, I think everyone kind of would agree with you. I think that starting in the trenches is kind of what I think the fan base would want in terms of offensive line, defensive line, pass rush. Typically, the Seahawks over the last couple of years have actually used their higher round picks to get skill position players, running backs, receivers, etc. What in terms of the middle rounds, are there any guys in particular on your radar that you like in terms of maybe the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round at running back or receiver?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I actually quite like is the options that may be available in the undrafted free agent market for receivers. There's a guy called Marquez North who was I think he was a 5-star recruit at Tennessee, was really, really athletic and looked really good in his first year starting at Tennessee. And then he's had some injuries, had some inconsistencies, but he's got the complete package to be a really explosive player at the next level. I think he's probably going to go undrafted, but he's somebody that I would be petitioning to get into a camp and see if I can work with that guy. And there's also Duke Williams, who was kicked off the Auburn team. I think he's probably going to go undrafted as well. He's going to have a fantastic combine, by the way. But he's somebody who, because of all the character issues, he's got ideal size. He's probably going to run in the 4.4s. He's somebody that I would look at there. Again, sort of probably going to go in the later rounds or undrafted. As for sort of the rounds, middle rounds, it is going to be a real sweet spot for running backs at the end of the 2nd round all the way through until the early part of the 4th round. So the Seahawks have got 3 picks in that range. And you could just sort of reel off all of the names. My personal favorites are Alex Collins at Arkansas. I think if you want him, you're probably going to have to take him at number 56, which is Seattle's 2nd round pick. You're going to have Paul Perkins, who, again, I really like from UCLA. I don't think he's going to be around in the late 3rd. I think you're probably going to have to take him in round 2 if you want him, or move down a little bit. And then you've got others like Jordan Howard's probably going to go in round 3 or 4. You've got Kenneth Dixon that a lot of people like at Louisiana Tech. You've got Devontae Booker at Utah, who, again, a lot of people like. I feel like I'm missing 1 or 2 others as well. Oh, CJ Prosise at Notre Dame is another one who's going to go round 3 or 4. So there are a cluster of options there. I'm absolutely positive that the Seahawks are going to take a running back with their first 4 picks in round 1, 2, or with a 2 in round 3. They're going to take a running back to add to this stable. I think they're consistently going to be adding running backs to their stable. And the sweet spot this year is certainly in that round 2, round 3, round 4 range where you're going to find some guys who can contribute very quickly.
I want this next question to sort of be more of a roundtable discussion. It's open for everybody, and maybe we'll all throw in some answers. But we sort of know which players might be on their way out as far as free agency or getting released or whatnot. J.R. Sweezy being one guy that seems to be clearly on his way out. Bruce Irvin, I think, will be difficult to retain. Given that I think teams like the Oakland Raiders will just have way too much money to compete for a guy like Bruce Irvin. The fact that they have Ken Norton already is another sign that I don't think that Bruce Irvin's going to be returning. That means that there are going to be spots opening up on this roster for starters and for reserves that play a lot, because we know that reserves do play a lot. And every year there are guys that step up and become bigger parts of the offense and defense that we really did not know about. I mean, this year, I think this past season, there were less of those guys that had sort of been around for a while. If you go in the past, You might see a guy like a Byron Maxwell who was around for a long time and then stepped up, or a Jordan Hill who stepped up maybe in his second year. So I'm kind of trying to ask everybody to pick out guys that are on the roster already who maybe had come along in 2013 or 14 or 15 and been reserved or been injured or just haven't had the opportunities to play, and just sort of pick out some of your breakout players for 2016. Because like I was saying last year, I think a lot of the breakout players, they were guys that didn't come along until after the draft. Tyler Lockett, Frank Clark, and Thomas Rawls. And some of the guys on the offensive line, like a Gary Gilliam, I think he had a nice little breakout season. It's harder to judge for the offensive tackles and offensive linemen. But Danny, why don't you start? Just can you give me one name of a guy that you think is going to break out? And I think that when one person says something, the other two, just sort of talk about whether or not they agree. And guys, don't be afraid to mix it up and disagree.
I would say the first person I would throw out is Mark Glowinski, because I think that J.R. Sweezy is probably going to get a better offer out in free agency, and the Seahawks will probably let him go. Although I know that it seems like Cable really likes him, so maybe that will affect things and they'll manage to keep him. But assuming the Seahawks keep Okun on the outside and let Sweezy go, I could see Glowinski inherit that spot at the right guard. And he had one game where he looked pretty good this year. I think that in general, he's got the athletic makeup that they like. He's, physical, tough guy, and so he could be a real breakout player in terms of, people that you haven't really seen that much of. I think, I'll start with him, and I'll get your guys' thoughts on that. I think Glowinski could be like a big name next year.
Rob, do you agree with that? How do you see the right guard playing out next season?
Yeah, I think that Danny's absolutely right, because it's going to be tough to keep hold of J.R. Sweezy, and it rang Gatland saying yesterday that he's going to have a heavy market, and it'll only take sort of one team to offer $4.5 million, and I think that even that will be too much for the Seahawks, because they can sign probably, I think that Davis estimated about $18 million for 7 free agents that are going to earn more than $2 million a year. So let's imagine that on average you could probably get like 4 of those guys on $4 million, and then that gives you a little bit of room maybe to go and do other things. So I can't see J.R. Sweezy being one of the 4. I think they're going to prioritize Jeremy Lane, Mebane, Rubin, and one of them, maybe it will be Sweezy, but it just seems like that's a pretty easy one you can put in there. Glowinski in there. I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Danny did take the easy way out. Go ahead.
I'm gonna offer another name. Maybe Russell Wilson's gonna have a breakout year as well. I don't know. But
as far as I would definitely agree with Glowinski's potential for a breakout. My only reservation, would just be bringing up a name like Alvin Bailey. That the offensive linemen have shown flashes. So we just don't know yet. And I do think that J.R. Sweezy is gone, but it's certainly going to be a competition at right guard and center and probably left guard and potentially left tackle and right tackle if Russell Okung leaves. So it's definitely going to be a competition, but Glowinski does seem to have the early lead, especially after they had taken those offensive linemen. Terry Poole quickly fell out of favor, and Glowinski, it seems, has stepped up. Rob, what was going to be your next breakout player?
Well, I think that because of it may be a bit too expensive to keep Jeremy Lane, and they're going to have to find a solution on the quarterback position. So I'm going to take a punt on Stanley Jean-Baptiste, and it's kind of like a calculated gamble because he's clearly a good player. I mean, he went in the round 2, just the 2014 draft. I think that the problem the Saints have had is that they've tried to recreate what the Seahawks had in the secondary, by going big on Jairus Byrd, big name free agent safety, bring in Brandon Browner, go and draft a 6'3", 218-pound cornerback. The problem that the Saints had is that they had no idea how to coach the technique or to. It's about more than just big bodies and a good safety. It's about the whole package that comes with the way that the Seahawks coach their cornerbacks and the techniques that they use and playing within themselves and in the scheme. So I actually think that Stanley Jean-Baptiste, he's clearly got the talent, which is why he went in round 2 just a couple of years ago. This isn't a guy who went in round 2 5 years ago. This was 2 years ago. He's going to come in, they're going to coach him up. Somebody's going to get a chance to sort of step up to the plate and play some football at quarterback for the Seahawks this year. So out of all of the names, why can't it be Stanley Jean-Baptiste? He's got the size. He's a Seahawks-type cornerback. So let's see if they can train him up and maybe get him some game time this year.
Kenny, I know that you're looking for people to argue in this, but I love that get. I love that guess by Rob. I think he's the kind of name that could really like become a household name for Seahawks fans next year, potentially even start. So I really like that name just because I mean watching him come out of Nebraska, he looked exactly like what I pictured a Seahawks corner looking like. He can run, he can look for the ball, which is a big thing. Like if you remember watching Kelly Jennings play corner, he's obviously fast, sticky in coverage, but the guy would always catch the ball like right over his shoulder just because he would never look for it in the air. That's something I really like about Jean Baptiste is that he's really good at running and bump and run, and then knowing when to turn and look for the football. And I noticed that a lot watching his college tape. I don't know what happened in New Orleans. It's a little suspect that he didn't have any interest anywhere else really, but just from things I've heard, I think the Seahawks are high on this guy and like his potential. I think they have some pretty interesting guys at the cornerback position. I think obviously you throw Thurald Simon into the mix if he can get healthy. He could be a starter. I think they traded for Mohamed Cisse, so they obviously like him in terms of his potential and his athleticism and all that. And then Ty Smith, I think, is a dark horse to potentially be a starter / real role player. So yeah, the cornerback position is going to be really interesting, but I also really like Stanley Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah, well, I was going to say Thurald Simon. I thought that Rob was going to steal my answer when he was talking about Jeremy Lane leaving. I definitely think Thurald Simon's probably the more obvious answer, right? I mean, I guess the only injuries, being the biggest concern. Do you guys sort of, another guy don't you guys sort of aren't have some interest in George Farmer? Wasn't he one of the big names, or maybe one of the top names when they went out and they got those futures?
Yeah, and Pete Carroll even mentioned him in a press conference, like in reference to the guys that fans don't know about yet that they're excited about. He mentioned Farmer in that sense. So he's real raw though. Like he was a receiver in college, and maybe I can't remember if he played offense. Maybe he was like a running back or something. But yeah, he was a receiver in college, and so he's making the switch, and so you just never really know about that. But
yeah, go ahead.
I was just say he has the physical makeup that they love. Obviously, he's 6
I think
foot
we'd
220.
like to see Doug McNeil break out in some way.
Yeah.
As a friend of the show, I think we're all rooting for Douglas McNeil. He's still on the team, so they still have the opportunity to retain him and see how he develops. But also, I would say Christian Sicoli. J.R. Sweezy did not. He made the transition from defensive line to offensive line, and really it was his second season that he really became a starter and was able to develop. Sicoli, they kept him on the roster for the entire season. They did not want to lose him. Obviously, he was considered, the king of spark of all time, and just a phenomenal athlete. Rob, we have so little information on Sicoli's development. How crazy is it to think that Sicoli, a year and a half after 2 years after playing defensive line at Buffalo, that he could be starting at offensive line for the Seahawks?
I think it's very unlikely, and I think that people have maybe overplayed or overstated the Seahawks sort of feeling with Sicoli. So a lot of people on my blog say, oh, well, Sicoli's the future. They've said that. Well, actually what happened is at the end of the year, Pete Carroll was asked specifically about Sicoli, and they said, are you going to continue to use him at center? And he basically went, yeah, we want to keep him there. We didn't have a chance to look at him much this year for whatever reason, but we like him in that position. We like his upside, so we'll give him another year. We'll see how he looks. I think the fact that he was such a spark demon is probably what kept him on the roster. They're clearly intrigued by that, and it was too much to sort of just throw it away or risk losing him to another team who could stash him and maybe work on him themselves. So they wanted to keep him just to see if that project could work. But they've kind of done that with other guys in the past. I mean, they kept Jamison Cons for forever, trying to work him into some kind of position, and it just didn't work out. I mean, Sicoli's going to have to take a major leap forward in camp, I think, to make the team next year and to show that he warrants that sort of continued projection as someone who could potentially start for them. It's going to be interesting to see what they do at center as well, because there's some decent centers in this draft class. So if they draft a center, they're probably not going to be hoping too much that Sicoli starts in the future. If they take a veteran plug-in, or if they continue with Patrick Lewis, then maybe there's an option for Sicoli to come into play, in the next year or two. But I think it's a real stretch to think that he could start for the Seahawks in 2016.
Danny, go ahead.
I was just gonna throw out another name, but did you
Oh yeah,
want
I
to?
was just going to ask you to throw out another name. So there you go.
So yeah, so my thinking, my question is, let's just assume Jimmy Graham isn't gonna be ready to start out the year, right? He's probably gonna start on the PUP list, even though Pete Carroll is famously optimistic about this. I think the conservative thing to do is say we might not see Graham until whatever, week 6 or something. So um, the question is, what do they do at tight end? And I think Luke Wilson's probably the general, like, he's the favorite to be the starter. Cooper Helford will probably feature in there. But they'll probably go with 3 guys. And so the interesting guy to me is this guy, Brandon Cottom, who, was a pretty interesting UDFA from Purdue, I believe. He, was super athletic, big guy, 6'2", 262, kind of like a running back, halfback, fullback hybrid. So he's like an H-back type, and I like the idea of them using him kind of in a varied multiple role. So he's a guy that I kind of want to see, in training camp and everything. I'm interested to watch him play, and then it'll be interesting to see if they try and bring Chase Kaufman back, because you heard a lot of good stuff about him in terms of what the Seahawks saw, how quickly he seemed to link up and sync up with Russell Wilson. So obviously he's a free agent, but he's the guy that I could see potentially them bringing back and being a bigger part of the offense early on in the season. I don't really know much about Ronnie Shields. He is a guy they signed to a futures contract, but I think that Brandon Cottom will be a guy to watch.
Yeah, Rob, what do you think of the tight end depth?
Yeah, I like the idea. I mean, he was one of the guys I was thinking of actually to answer this question. So I totally agree with Danny, and they're going to have to
So
make
much love, so much love on this show.
Right, and you wanted us to argue as well. Danny. We're all agreeing with each other.
Brandon Cottom, are you guys freaking
we
kidding?
we could talk about Cam Newton if you want.
Cam Newton.
Yeah. Well, on Cotton, I think that there's an obvious possibility that he could come in because they can save a bit of money there because they're going to use him at fullback maybe. Derek Coleman's future is up in the air at the moment. You've got Tukuafu, who is maybe going to cost a little bit too much maybe to bring him back. You can maybe plug Cotton in there a little bit cheaper. You could use him at tight end as well. Maybe he's just going to be one of those guys who's really versatile, who can play different roles in which they seem to like. He's definitely someone to keep an eye on because as Danny says, Jimmy Graham's probably going to start the season on the pup list. He's probably going to miss the first few weeks of the season anyway. So rather than go and make a big addition in free agency at tight end or go and draft a guy, they're probably going to have to fill somebody into that. So is it going to be Chase Kaufman? Is it going to be Brandon Cotton? Maybe that's a little camp battle that's going to go on as they just try and fill in that third tight end spot for the first few weeks and just sort of lean on Luke Wilson and Cooper Helford until Graham comes back and sort of find who's going to be that number 3.
Well, if we're going to argue at all, maybe what we should do is let's just kick it up a notch. And instead of, talking about guys that might make the team or play a little bit, how about like that Doug Baldwin type breakout? Who are some guys, and I'll start out and I'll just say what about like for example, Frank Clark going from, a nice first season where, he was out there and he had some production in small spurts to, potentially being the guy that does, show a future behind, say, Cliff Averill or Michael Bennett that can become a full-time defensive end. What do you guys think about, and Danny, what do you think about the idea of Frank Clark next year putting up some of those, some huge numbers, maybe something like 10, 11 sacks and being a run stuffer?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to forget how completely dominant he was in the preseason last year. And, of course, that's preseason. And then, during the season, he didn't get as much playing time as you'd like to see, kind of hot and cold. He would show up at times and you're, like, really excited about it. But then he would kind of, disappear at times. But he's a rookie, and I think they were trying to, be careful about having him hit that rookie wall, I think, too early on. And so they limited his snaps. Plus, it's hard to give him snaps when you've got Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and Mebane and Jordan Hill and all these guys that are really, really good too. But I really, really like the potential of Frank Clark. I know he's going to be on a lot of people's lists as a breakout player this year. And I think they actually like him inside more. I think they like him against guards and centers more than against tackles and whatnot. So I think we'll see him play inside in different sub packages with Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill, where they kind of like move those guys around, figure out what works best in terms of their stunts and their different games that they play on the defensive line and passing situations. So I think he's going to factor pretty big in that. And he could actually play base downs. He could spell Michael Bennett a little bit in terms of the run defense. I think he's probably a pretty good run defender. He's got huge long arms. He's really stout, big guy, powerful guy. So I think he's going to be a huge player on their defensive line next year. I think you can expect him to be a big factor and potentially take over. He'll probably he could be the guy that plays more than Jordan Hill.
Yeah, I mean, Rob, when we did the shows last year during the draft, you talked about Frank Clark, as being pretty much a physical comparison to Jadeveon Clowney, and that he was as good as that. But the issues that he had with domestic abuse charges and such is what caused him to fall. How would you grade Frank Clark's first season? What do you see for him for year two?
Well, here's the thing, Pete Carroll's defense, he knows what he wants to do, and he's created the number one defense in the NFL over the last few years, doing it his way. But the one thing that his scheme is predicated on, it's completely about discipline and doing your job and playing stout and taking away the run. And it's not conducive to huge sort of stat production in terms of sacks. So what the Seahawks had for basically the first 2 or 3 years of Carroll's time here was one pass rush specialist who had all of the production, and that was Chris Clemens. And sort of last year they moved it on a step, and obviously Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill had the stats. But it's tough for the other guys to sort of get in there. And the one issue I think, if Frank Clark was playing for a team like Buffalo, for example, or the Jets, I think he probably would have had 6 or 7 sacks last year because he's just physically excellent. You could see what he was doing in preseason. But because they ask him to be so disciplined with his gap control and, making sure that he's in position, sort of doing his job, watching his gap or, covering the right spot on the field, it means that he's not sort of been given that freedom to go and rush the passer as much. And when he was given that freedom, look at the Minnesota game in regular season, for example, he was very, very productive doing it. So it'll be interesting to see if they kind of take the harness off him a little bit and let him just go for the pass rush, or whether he's going to be held back a little bit. But he wouldn't be the first person who sort of underachieved statistically under Pete Carroll. I mean, if you can go back to when he was at USC, Clay Matthews had 5 sacks in 4 years at USC. And was drafted in the first round and became, instantly a pass rusher for the Green Bay Packers. Of those 5 sacks, he had 4 in his final year at USC. So Carroll did not use him as a pass rusher at all. He used him as a linebacker. He went to Green Bay and became a pass rusher. So I don't think Seattle's scheme is ever going to be conducive for Frank Clark having major, major production, even though he's got the potential to do it.
How does Cassius Marsh fit into that? Because he's another guy that you really liked when the Seahawks took him.
Yeah, and I'm surprised with what they've done with him, because when he was at his best at UCLA, he was rushing inside. And I wondered whether or not they were going to try and turn him into sort of an undersized 3-technique specialist inside rusher, because he had a lot of help there and with sort of a bigger guy next to him, and he was really productive doing that role. And yet they've gone the other way. They've made him lighter, and he's been playing some coverage, and the way that he tackled Adrian Peterson on that screen in Minnesota in the regular season, he flashed like a level of athleticism there, which has had people sort of discussing whether or not he's going to replace Bruce Irvin, which I don't think is going to happen. But there's certainly something to him. I think he probably suffers in the same way that Clark does. I don't think he's ever going to have the big stats because of the way that Carroll's defense runs. But I think that he's somebody who will continue to contribute. Look at the job he did on special teams at the back end of last year. I mean, wasn't he just the most underrated special teams guy in the NFL for the last 3 or 4 weeks of the regular season?
Yeah, he had a couple tackles on punts and stuff.
Yeah, he was terrific. His coverage in special teams is superb.
Yeah.
That may be his sort of best value to the Seahawks.
I talked to Jay Glazer about Cassius Marsh back at the Super Bowl 2 years ago. And he couldn't stop singing his praises. He just loves the guy in terms of his work ethic, and they do a lot of like the martial arts hand use and stuff like that. Said he's really, really good with his hands. So, I haven't seen a ton from Cassius in terms of pass rushing and everything like that, but he should have a pretty big opportunity this year, I think, to kind of take over that role, assuming that Bruce Irvin's gone. And we've seen it happen in the past where guys don't really look like much, and then all of a sudden, they get a chance and they kind of break out. So I think that Marsh is a guy that you have to keep an eye on. I don't have super high hopes for him, but I do like him. Like you said, I like him as a special teams guy, a core guy. Kind of just a guy that does his job and everything like that. But it would be really cool to see him break out as more of a pass rusher. He's definitely slimmed down a lot. It seems like, over the life of his career in terms of, obviously in UCLA he was up to like 295 at one point or something like that, and I think he's more like 250 now, 255. So I don't know. Cassius is definitely a guy that intrigues me, but I haven't seen much from him in terms of as a pure pass rusher on the outside yet. But that's it's one of those things that sometimes just kind of comes out of nowhere.
Before we move on to the next segment and almost wrap things up, I mean, I just want to give you. Is there anyone else that you had on the tip of your tongue that you wanted to mention as a breakout? And just don't say Thomas Rawls, because that's we're going to get to that next. So, is there anybody else that you wanted to single out, Rob?
Well, I just think that Jordan Hill is going to have a bounce-back year. It's a contract year for him, so there's a lot at stake there. If people were watching Jordan Hill in this draft class, they'd be saying, oh, what a great addition he would be, because when he was at Penn State, very natural pass rusher, he did really well at the back end of the 2014 season and showed what he's capable of. I have no idea what went wrong last year. It just didn't happen for him, but he's in a contract year. He needs a big year this year, so I'm banking on him having a return to form.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, Danny. If you don't have to have an answer, you can just say, yeah, you can say something about Jordan Hill if you want.
No, I mean, I think the guy that I've still got my hopes up for is Paul Richardson. He's a guy that he is like annually, like, people are excited about him. Kind of like in the Christian Michael mold, where you're really excited about his potential to come in and produce, but for him, it's been injuries, and you never really know if he's ever going to get to the point where he's consistently healthy. Even going back into his college career, he is, consistently been injured. So I really like him potential-wise, and so with Jermaine Kearse probably leaving in free agency, he has a spot that he could inherit there. And so he could be a big player for the Seahawks next year, kind of coming out of nowhere. Not nowhere, but, he hasn't really done a whole lot in his career so far. He's a second-round pick. They talked about picking him in the first round, so they obviously love the guy.
Theoretically, You're talking about bringing back Doug Baldwin and coming after his 14-touchdown season. You're talking about Tyler Lockett, everyone expecting him to become perhaps a 1,000-yard receiver. Everybody's really excited about his future. And then you are talking potentially about a Paul Richardson-type talent if he can stay healthy. And Jimmy Graham, perhaps mid-season, coming back. Now, all of a sudden, Russell Wilson has some of the best weapons, you'd think in the NFL that he's ever had. And I think, competing up there with the rest of the NFC as far as receiver goes, and giving Russell Wilson a chance to, put up yet an even bigger season that he had last year. And I don't think we still really have a contextual sort of understanding of how good Russell Wilson was last season. I still don't really quite understand the numbers when you look at it and you see like 34 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. I mean, this is a guy that nobody expected to, do anything close to that. And these are really Aaron Rodgers at his peak type numbers. And I don't think people really sit back and say that. At least, they don't really say that. I think a lot of the focus has been on Cam Newton and everything like that. But if he has that many weapons and they do excel at the rate that they have been, it would be something pretty interesting to watch if Paul Richardson were able to stay healthy. Now, as far as Thomas Rawls, I said not to mention him. I do kind of want to do one other thing as far as breakout players and talk about Thomas Rawls. Now, I like to spend some time on Reddit, and I think the relationships subreddit is an interesting one, and sometimes, this was actually on Confessions. So the Confessions one is where people can say things that they want to get off their chest. And one of the confessions today was a guy or whatever, probably, a guy in high school or maybe another type of school, and he was talking about how he likes to watch adult movies with his buddy, his best friend, and take care of themselves, and then not in according to him, not in a weird way, but that's kind of what I want to do theoretically when talking about Thomas Rawls. Is just three dudes here talking about Thomas Rawls and having some football masturbation about his potential for next season, because I think we all have I think we're three guys sitting here thinking that we could have, one of the most special players in the league, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Danny, do you think that Thomas Rawls could theoretically, become a superstar in the NFL as soon as next year?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, first of all, like the eye test tells you, he runs really hard. He runs really aggressively. He showed good vision in terms of a couple of his runs. You're like, damn, how did he decide to make like that cut right there? Because that was like brilliant. The run against the Bengals where he made a couple cuts and then right at the last second before he went outside, he cut inside, like in front of the cornerback and managed to get to the edge. I don't know, just some of his cuts and some of his vision, creativity as a runner has been really good. He's obviously a good tackle breaker. He led the NFL in yards after contact, led the NFL in yards per carry, and that was against mostly base down defenses. And so, he's going up against, the defenses that are meant to stop the run. He's not getting like yards per carry when it's like 3rd and 10 and they're just like handing it off to him. So all the stats point to the fact that he was the real deal in for the Seahawks last year. I wrote about that this week, but like honestly, he just looks he was just so good. He's a good receiver. Seems to really really fit the Seahawks scheme. Great fit for the zone blocking scheme, and so yeah, I think he has the potential to be like superstar breakout type player. You try and think of like reasons to be like skeptical about it. I just can't think of any reason other than the injury thing, which is you could really say that about any player in the NFL. If he gets injured or if he stays injured, they're not going to be as good. But in terms of talent, I don't think there's any reason to doubt.
Yeah, I mean, and as far as some of the explanations, and I've seen some really ignorant and lazy reasons why people think that Thomas Rawls was successful last year, including the system of the Seahawks or the fact that teams were preparing for Marshawn Lynch, so they didn't know how to prepare for Thomas Rawls. They didn't know there was no tape on Thomas Rawls. They didn't know anything about Thomas Rawls. I mean, that's a theory of a person that just simply did not watch the games and did not see that it's really just Thomas Rawls against defensive players and beating them and making the right decisions. I mean, that run against the Bengals is bananas. It's up there with Marshawn Lynch's best runs. Maybe not the top 2 runs in Lynch's career, but it could be like number 3, what Thomas Rawls was able to do against the Bengals. We saw that he had 2 games as a Seahawk last year, and as a rookie who started something like 7 games, have more yards in a game twice than Marshawn Lynch has had in his entire career. We see the numbers, the 5.8 yards per carry against the box or whatever it is, the fact that he could do so much with only part-time carries. Rob, I know that you have just as much praise for Thomas Rawls. We talked about it on 3000 NFL Mock Draft as we tried to comp a player in the draft to a Thomas Rawls, and you said that there isn't a player in the draft as good as Thomas Rawls.
Before we start, I mean, after that introduction from Kenny, I say that I'm really pleased that we don't use the cameras on these things. Second of all, on Thomas Rawls, do you know what the greatest thing Thomas Rawls did as a rookie? He made Seahawks fans for a little while forget about Marshawn Lynch, which cannot be underestimated. I mean, think of saying to a Seahawks fan in 2014, hey, can you imagine what life is like when Marshawn Lynch retires? And they would sort of cringe and shudder with fear at the thought. And then midway through the 2015 season, people were kind of like, Marshawn who? We don't need this guy anymore. We've got Thomas Rawls. This guy's better. He glides into the second level. He turns, productive runs into big runs. And, people were saying things like, hey, when he hit that hole and he went through there and he burst off for an extra 20 yards, Marshawn Lynch would have seen the hole, probably may have made the wrong read, or he would have run into traffic, and he would have carried guys for another 5 or 6 yards, but he wouldn't have got the 20 or 30 yards that Thomas Rawls would have got. So, yeah, he made people forget about Marshawn Lynch and feel confident about the future. The only slight sort of asterisk I would put on this is that the Seahawks knew that they could rely on Marshawn Lynch and knew that he would be durable up until this year, obviously, and they knew that he was going to be out there on game day. And it's not about the ankle injury. It's just generally about Thomas Rawls. They don't know how durable he's going to be in his career. They don't know that he's going to be a guy who can play 16 games a year, run the ball 25 times a game, and be the heart and soul of the offense like Marshawn Lynch is. And I don't think for 1 minute that they're going to go into next year putting that kind of pressure under Thomas Rawls. And I think it's why they were semi-linked to DeMarco Murray by Ian Rappaport a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's why they'll probably get linked to other veteran running backs, and I think it's why they will ultimately draft a running back pretty high, because I don't think they want this to be a one-man thing going forward, and I think it'll probably be best for Thomas Rawls that they can, put him in for a series or two, put another guy in for a series or two, and have a genuine 1-2 punch, or even sort of a committee system going forward. I think that's the way it's probably going to be in the future.
And I think that it's just interesting. I just think that pretty soon, as far as offense goes, people are going to talk about the Seahawks and they're going to say, Russell Wilson number 1 and Thomas Rawls number 2. And it'll be as key. He'll be as key as Marshawn Lynch was. And yeah, you just can't predict injuries. And you did sort of have a better idea with Marshawn Lynch because you just had more to go off of. And we don't have much to go off of with Thomas Rawls except that he has suffered, a significant ankle injury in his first season. So it's not a good place to start, though. Frank Gore and Willis McGahee being a couple examples of guys. No, those are different injuries with the ACL, which, I can't compare one versus the other, but I would think that ACL is worse. But guys that we don't really talk about, especially Frank Gore, we don't talk about how poorly his health was considered to be going into the league, and why he was drafted in the 3rd round by the 49ers, and as far as I can tell, never ended up on IR in his career. And I just, as you mentioned, the fact that they probably will go out and get another running back in free agency, and veterans running backs are easy to come by. Good ones are easy to come by. They don't get re-signed. They don't get extended before they become free agents. And I just want to note some of the guys, and they won't go after a guy like Doug Martin, who will be the premier running back on the market. They won't go after a guy like that, but some of the other names out there could be Pierre Thomas, Chris Johnson, Ahmad Bradshaw, Stephen Ridley, Matt Asiata, Jaquiz Rogers, Chris Polk, Ronnie Hillman, Lance Dunbar, Jordan Todman, Tim Hightower, Bobby Rainey, James Starks, Fred Jackson, of course, Alfred Morris, Bernard Pierce, Kendall Hunter, Bryce Brown, Sean Drone, Chris Ivory, Bilal Powell, Robert Turbin, Lamar Miller, and it just keeps going on like that. Any of those guys stand out, and Matt Forte being a big name as well. I mean, Matt Forte might be at the point of his career where he does take a smaller contract and maybe is trying to make the playoffs with a team like the Seahawks. Danny, any thoughts on those guys or Matt Forte?
I don't think Matt Forte is going to be in the cards. I think he's probably going to be too expensive, and if they were going to use him, it'd probably be more like as a 3rd down back. But I do like Rob's idea of kind of like not putting it all on Rawls immediately, kind of trying to spread the weight of the job around. The names that stand out to me, I don't know how much Alfred Morris is going to fetch on the open market, but he's been playing in a zone game and has proven to be pretty good in that. Obviously he took a huge step back this year after, what did he have, 3 1,000-yard seasons in a row or something like that? But then he really just wasn't a big part of it this year. I know that because he was on my fantasy football team. But
the Redskins overall, with him and Matt Jones, he seemed to have a good season for a rookie, but really he wasn't that successful. Those same reasons that you talked about Thomas Rawls by PFF's numbers, Jones was one of the worst. So the Redskins overall were not successful too. So Alfred Morris could be better than last year's numbers indicate.
Right. Yeah. So like he would interest me. I think he's a good guy. Like he's a good runner. I have no idea what he's going to be able to get, so it's kind of depending on, how much interest he has. Stephen Ridley interests me. I think he's probably about 2 years off of his knee injury. I'm just doing this off of memory, but I think he did tear his ACL at one point. I don't know. There's not really a lot out there in terms of anything super interesting. I think they could get guys in that would be like, they could do the job, like Dan Herron, maybe Kendall Hunter.
I mean, we all expect Kristen Michael to come back too, right?
I would think Kristen Michael will come back. Kerry Robinson's a restricted free agent. He might be interesting. Chris Thompson's. Oh, never mind. He's an exclusive rights guy. So I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely some guys out there that could come in and you could be like, I mean, it's basically the same as like Bryce Brown. Like he could like carry the football some, but not be like super exciting or not like be like a game breaking type of player, but good enough to kind of do the job, kind of like a Robert Turbin. But hopefully better. I was never really too big on Robert Turbin after his rookie year, and I think there's a reason they let him go. But
Robert Staton, do you have any thoughts? Maybe someone that's flown under the radar and has not had a chance to spread their wings and fly, as it were?
No, I mean, obviously, I like Chris Ivory, but he's going to probably get too much money on the open market. But here's why I wouldn't be too interested in the free agents, and that's because Senquez Golson was the number 56 pick in 2015, and his rookie cap hit was $727,000. So if the Seahawks were to draft a running back in round 2, which is still pretty high, you're talking about a cap hit which is probably about $750,000. I mean, if you were going to get one of those veteran running backs to come on your team, you'd be looking at probably twice as much as that at least. If they were, let's just throw out a scenario. Let's say that they go crazy and draft Derrick Henry at 26. His rookie cap hit would only be $1.5 million. So that's still very cheap. And if they went in the bottom of round 3, I mean, it gets even lower. So you can just get a lot more value, and you are not taking up valuable cap space that you may need to bring in an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman or, a different position of need, or keep one of your own guys. You're not taking money up going with a veteran running back who's already got tread on the tires. And this is the kind of class where I think you could get someone who could really help you in round 2 or round 3, contribute very quickly, and get it at a really good discount price.
Yeah, and speaking of contributing, we're going to contribute one final segment, and as we've mentioned, Rob, you're not from the United States of America. You're from the ununited non-states of the UK. Oh wait, I could have said
UK does stand for United Kingdom.
No, I did not know that. Why don't you go with like the United Kingdom
known
of
fact.
the Castle? Listen, okay, I don't need to know words or what things mean, okay? I'm just an American, and that's what being an American is about. I mentioned Reddit earlier. I saw a Reddit thread today it's the top Ask Reddit of the day, and it's the topic is, what is one thing you'd like to ask people from the UK? We have the opportunity right now to ask someone from the UK some questions, and these are the top questions that they would like to ask someone from the UK. So Rob, if you could give the answers here for us now, we'll get an exclusive AMA with you. How does that sound?
This just sounds absolutely fantastic.
Oh, you're supposed to say brilliant. I mean, come on. Am I to tell you how to be a British person?
It's very good.
Okay, top question. I live and was born in the UK, but can anyone tell me what happens when the Queen reaches 100? Like, does she send herself a card or what?
Well, this is a very good question. I imagine that she won't need to send herself a card, but there'll be a lot of hype over here, probably a concert where I don't know if you know who these people are, but there is an old singer in England who gets wheeled out every time there's something like this. He's called Cliff Richard. Do you guys know who Cliff Richard is?
No.
You don't want to know who Cliff Richard is. Don't go and listen to his song. But he will be wheeled out and he will do something. Elton John will probably do something. Last time they had, it was actually the last celebration they had for the Queen. They had Stevie Wonder come over and do a song, and it wasn't the Queen's birthday. It was actually the celebration of her Jubilee, which meant when she became Queen. But he still wished her happy birthday before singing his song. I don't think he got the memo on. Obviously, he couldn't read it, but he didn't. He didn't get a message that it wasn't her birthday, but he still wished her happy birthday at the concert anyway. So that is what will probably happen: a big concert that everybody will get excited about.
This is going to be a bad question.
Go ahead. What was that?
Is Stevie Wonder British?
No, I was going to say something about, see, look, you're always turning to the Americans, but then I couldn't really say anything because, I mean, Paul McCartney and David Bowie and, these are pretty much the biggest musical artists in America. So
Right.
It's give and take. The second highest question is, you all right?
No, you don't. You're saying it wrong. That was like Australian.
You all right, mate?
You're all right, mate. Like you've got to, like if you were from London, you would say, "All right, mate." And if you were from where I'm from, which is Yorkshire, you'd say, "All right, mate."
I love this.
You all right, mate?
That's like Rob, you can answer this. That's kind of like a common. That's like for Americans, it's like sup. Like people say sup to each other. Like in England and Britain, would they like when they first see each other, they're like, "You all right?"
Well, we have lots of different ones. So over here we have A up, mate. So A up, it's spelled EYUP, and it's kind of like hey up, but we say A up.
I've never heard that.
Say, all right, mate, and you can just say, "Aya" or stuff like that. And there's lots of different greetings. Some of them I'd probably better not say on a family broadcast, but yeah, there's a lot of different ones.
Do you yell
family
"Oi"?
broadcast where where earlier I mentioned two guys jacking off together.
The family circle jerk hour.
Yeah, that's kind of curious too, because now I'm thinking about like slang and that kind of thing. Do the British, is there like a rap scene in the UK? Do you guys like the popular American rappers?
There is like a rap, like a rap sort of grimy hip hop type scene. So there's some musicians. There's a guy called Tinchy Strider. Have you heard of him?
I think I have maybe once or twice.
And there's a guy called Dizzy Rascal.
I've heard of him.
These are the most British names ever.
Yeah, Dizzy Rascal, and he's fairly popular. But it's really sort of when the British music enthusiasts go for their like rap and hip hop, it's pretty much the old school American artists, and everybody pretends that they love Dre over here as well. So,
what do you guys think of? What did you think of Coldplay at the Super Bowl?
Well, I didn't actually see it because what I did is I had to work at, like last year when the Seahawks played it, I had to actually be at work at 5:30 in the morning over here, which was just after the Super Bowl finished. So what I did is I watched the first half, went to bed at halftime, and then woke up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, which was after about 2 or 3 hours sleep, and then just sort of watched the second half on fast forwarding through the breaks and stuff. So I saw the back end of it. I thought that I think I saw Beyonce nearly fall over at one point and then do this kind of, I didn't nearly fall over kind of move to try and disguise it, but that's all I remember from it.
I mean, the Coldplay gets a lot of flack in the U.S. They're considered to be sort of like a, that people just say that it's like shitty music, or that they don't like it. Do you get any of that sense from in the UK?
Oh yeah, everybody thinks they're mundane, run-of-the-mill crap. But my when I met my wife, she boasted that she'd seen Coldplay like a few weeks before we met, and I basically said that I was not impressed by that. She went to Bolton to see them, which is about an hour and a half away from where we are, and missed her train home, so I had to stay in a hotel that night. And I thought, well, what a waste of money and time. When I lived in Vancouver, they were probably at the height of their sort of popularity, and people would often ask me, oh, do you like Coldplay? And I was like, no. Just because they're British and I am British doesn't mean that I have to like them.
Right.
So no.
I'm surprised.
They're not very. They
tea with her again. What's that?
Well, they're pretty mainstream. They're pretty mainstream Coldplay, so there's going to be people who like them, but I would say the majority are pretty sick of hearing that. There's that riff that they have in their sort of new song that was advertising the fact that they were performing at the Super Bowl, and it popped up every time CBS did a game. Every time I hear that, I just want to throw the radio across the room.
Let's hit up a few more of these. The next question: how is your relationship with the Irish?
Well, this is a very politically charged question.
Yeah, geez, Kenny.
Hey, I don't choose the questions, all right? But how is your relationship with the Irish, and what do you want to do to them?
Hey, by the way, Rob, my name is Daniel Brawley Kelly, just so you know.
Well, look, I have no personal angst with the Irish whatsoever. They do tend to beat us at rugby these days, so that's my big gripe with them. Although I think we'll beat them this year, and I did actually go and watch England beat Ireland before the Rugby World Cup, so that's all good. I think that Britain's relationship with Ireland is as strong as it has been for a long, long time, but obviously there is still some tension there. There's been a bit of trouble over the last few weeks, but my personal relationship with the Irish is fantastic. I worked with a lot of Irish people when I was in Vancouver, and they could not have been more charming and brilliant. So, yeah, I'm quite cool with the Irish.
Great answer.
This is one of the most popular food pictures I see on the internet and on Reddit, so this is a good one too. How often do you actually have a full English breakfast?
Wow, Ian. It's probably more often than you think. So it's seen as a treat more than a regular thing. You wouldn't have it every day. But if I was out and about somewhere, or if I was out with some work colleagues or some friends, and we'd sort of had a big sort of night out or something the night before, the only breakfast you can have the day after is a full English breakfast. So I would say I probably have maybe one a month.
And to just stick to the food item, we'll get a couple more of these. Is tea really that big a thing there?
Oh yeah, but like I'm obsessed with Starbucks and have a Starbucks card which is constantly. I mean, I live in Starbucks when I'm out about. Like I will go in Starbucks every other day. Um, and when I lived in Canada, I was obsessed with Tim Hortons and could not. I went in Tim Hortons every day. When the last time I went to watch the Seahawks play, there were days when I would have had sort of 3 extra large coffees from Tim Hortons in one day. And came home having put on about half a stone because of it, because it's full of sugar. But
Half a stone. Can you tell us what a stone is?
it's 14 pounds.
Okay.
So half a stone's like 7 pounds.
It must be helpful for people to just be like, I'm not that big. I weigh, 20 stone. It's no big deal.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I weigh about 190 pounds right now. So it was quite a big deal to come back
Yeah,
having.
but you're pure stone.
It's about 13 and a bit stone. But it was. I came back and none of my trousers fit because I'd been drinking Tim Hortons every day. So that was.
Trousers. This is the greatest conversation ever.
We'll end on this one.
Wanted it to be British.
We'll,
Do you
we'll end
guys not use the word trousers over there?
No, we don't. Unless we're joking.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're missing out.
Maybe I thought you would say pantaloons or something.
My knickerbockers.
You see, you use the word pants, and we use the word pants to describe underwear. So
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
those are underpants.
we just just call them pants. So
This is the last one. I think it's good for a guy that works. You have to do a lot of sporting events, and you're out there at the old football matches constantly. A lot of, and in football, for the most part, all has to do with weather. This question is, how do you spend your one day of sunshine each year?
from people who are from Seattle, that is a question.
Well, these aren't people from Seattle.
Kettle
This is
black
Reddit,
here.
friend.
Well, how would I spend my one day of? I mean, I would. The great thing about England is, as urbanized. I mean, it's a very small island. Sort of compare it to France. There's probably as many people living in France as there is in Britain, and France is like 5 times as big as Britain. So there's some very urbanized areas, but there's also some fantastic countryside that you just won't find anywhere else in the world. So I'm very privileged that I live in Yorkshire, which is one of the greener parts, and Sheffield, the nearest city to me, is the greenest part of the UK. So, I would love to. I'd probably just go and take my dog and my son and my wife, and we'd probably just go spend some time in the sun and, soak it in, seeing as it only comes around once a year.
Do you have a
But you
Yorkshire Terrier?
I don't. I have a Jack Russell, which is it's obviously you must know what a Jack Russell is, but
Yeah.
it's kind of common with the region.
But yeah, in all seriousness, how you for doing the soccer matches, the football matches, excuse me, for doing the matches and in doing it in Sheffield, is it sunny? Do you have like a season where it's like, let's go out there and let's do most of these matches when it's the warmer season?
The weather here is pretty similar to what it is in Seattle and Vancouver. But it's certainly very similar to Vancouver. So what we have is we've had like you guys, I understand it, we've had a pretty warm December and January. It's been, I think, the warmest December and January on record. Right now it's pretty cold, but then when it gets to spring, it's probably going to be pretty mild. And then when you get to summer, it can be very hot during the summer. You get some very hot days. But then when it gets to sort of September, that's probably like the nicest time. September, going into the autumn and fall. So yeah, I mean, and covering the the English soccer, I've got to say that this has been the best. I've not had to wear two coats to a game yet, and usually at this time of the year, I've had three coats on. It's been so cold. So the most annoying thing is in the NFL they never call it. If they're going to call a game off, it has to be like an earthquake. It has to be like the film in the third Batman film when the sort of the bomb goes off and destroys the field. That's kind of what it will take to get an NFL game off. Well, over here, you could be driving 3 hours down the road and you arrive at the ground and they say, the pitch is too wet, the game's called off. And you just have to drive back home and you don't cover the game. So it can be a little bit frustrating with the weather.
Yeah, I hate it when the pitch is wet. That's the end of this episode of Reel in the Field Goals. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton. As always, make sure to check out SeahawksDraftBlog.com for all of those updates on the prospects that are going through the drafts, mock drafts, constantly being updated. And, of course, listen to 3000 NFL Mock Drafts with myself and Rob. We'll be back next Monday or Tuesday. We'll be previewing the Combine with at least Dan Kadar mocking the draft. The following week, you can tune in to listen to Danny on as our guest. He'll be talking about his experiences at the Combine. Subscribe to Reel in the Field Goals as well. Go to fieldgoals.com and follow on Twitter at fieldgoals. And that's the end of this episode. We want to thank Rob for sticking up with us Americans, asking dumb questions about what it is to be British. And but we love it and appreciate it. So,
Mate.
Thank you, mate. That's it for this episode, and remember to keep it real.